what's at stake in this opposition between lack and loss? I'll just say this, that I think if you think in terms of loss, then there's always this lurking possibility, even if you know that it can't be realized, of re-obtaining the thing that's been lost. And I think it shapes the way you think of desire. If you think that initially there was some kind of identity, some kind of wholeness, some kind of oneness that's subsequently lost, then you think, well, desire is about the desire to regain wholeness. And I think that is absolutely wrong. I think that is not the nature of unconscious desire. And it seems to me like that's one way in which this idea of loss is deceptive. That if you invest yourself in loss, I think it just follows from that you're going to invest yourself in the idea of overcoming lack, regaining wholeness. That is not the way that desire works. So if we think about lack as our starting point rather than loss, then all of a sudden the nature of desire changes. So lack and desire, to me, are just this two different names for the same thing. So how can there be lack if there's nothing that was originally lost? That's the idea, and I think that's what the psychoanalytic tradition that I'm talking about wants to get at. That lack itself is the starting point. It's not the lack of something. In fact, it's the lack of nothing. And I think that's the key idea. And I think one way to think about that is to think about the opposition between subjectivity and whatever kind of symbolic identity one has. One essential core of the idea of lack is that one never is one's symbolic identity. So subjectivity is the failure to be any kind of identity. So no matter what identity comes along, I can try to assume that identity, but no matter how much effort I make to be that thing, I can't be it. And again, it's the idea isn't that initially I was this identity and then I lost it and now I'm going to try to regain it. No, every attempt to get it is a failure, and because I didn't once have it, I come into existence in relationship to that identity, but I'm always failing to get this identity. And I think this is one can think in terms of what Louis Althusser calls the ideological hail of the subject. So ideology is trying to hail you into this is a detour from Althusser would not. He thinks ideology hails us as a subject. I want to say, no, ideology hails us as a symbolic identity. So ideology confronts subjects and says, you are this symbolic identity. But no matter how much we strive to be the thing that ideology sets up for us to be, we never fully are that thing. Starting with your name, right? Like there's a sense everyone's had this experience of a certain alienation from one's own name. I have a neighbor who's like 7 years old, 6 years old, something. And she all of a sudden just found her own name alienating. And she said, I'm just going to go by my Hebrew name. Her actual name is Cordelia and her Hebrew name is Maya. And she said, I'm just going to go I only want to be called Maya now. So and this lasted, I don't know, 2-3 months. And then she went back. She got over the alienation. But the idea is that, and I think everyone is excited. We thought it was funny, but not because we thought she was crazy, but because we thought, well, wow, that's a real nice indication of the way in which no matter how much you like your name, you still have this moment of distance from it or alienation from it that you can't get over. And I think that's the first way in which lack is most often evident to us relative to the relationship between subjectivity and symbolic identity, that we don't fit in the name. The other thing I think is that certain symbolic roles that have an identity attached to them come down to us, and our disjunction with them is constantly made evident to us because of the way in which our desire doesn't fit within the confines of the identity, right? So lack is one way I think of thinking of it, which to me is helpful, is lack is the lack of a symbolic identity. So whatever identity, say And I think the symbolic identity that can run the gambit. So it can be the name, right, which is a clear symbolic thing. It can be a certain job title, like professor, lawyer, dentist, teacher. Any of these titles, they all have a symbolic investiture attached to them. And so you tried, by adopting that title, you try to align yourself with the identity and think that that's just what I am. But then every time you do that, you feel this inadequacy, or you experience the inadequacy of the identity and yourself relative to the identity. So I think the inadequacy works in both ways. So you both feel, you experience that the identity doesn't work for you, but also that you don't work for the identity. So I never am adequate to the identity. Anytime, and this happens almost every time I go in front of a class as a professor, I have the experience like, I'm not the real professor. The real professor is somewhere else. And I think it's especially true if anyone's been a parent. Like I constantly think like, Father, wait, that's what that guy was for me. It's not what I am relative to my kids, right? So there's no, I feel like I don't meet, I'm inadequate to that symbolic identity, and that divorce. So it doesn't really, again, it doesn't really matter if is subjectivity inadequate to the identity, or is the identity inadequate to the subject, because the point is there's a disjunction between the two, and that disjunction is what creates the lacking being. That's why subjectivity is lacking, because it can't coincide with itself in any kind of symbolic identity. So Hamlet, written in 1600, dawn of modernity, Hamlet, I think, expresses, and I think this is what Lacan was onto and why he focused on it, expresses lacking subjectivity and the relationship, the way in which lack is desire, better than maybe any literary figure, certainly up until that time, but maybe even subsequently. What Hamlet does is he acts through his posing of questions to his symbolic mandate. So he gets a mandate. So I mentioned this early scene from where Claudius calls him his son and really gives him a symbolic mandate. But then in the subsequent scene, in Act 1, he gets another, so he does it, this mandate from Claudius. It's pretty easy for him to reject. But then in the subsequent scene, as everyone knows, he gets a mandate from his father. And I think this one is much more difficult to reject, because the father's saying, look, prove yourself to be a real son, avenge my most foul and awful murder, and kill Claudius, right? So Hamlet doesn't do it. I mean, eventually he does it, but he doesn't do it immediately. It's like, well, wait a minute, how am I sure that this ghost is really my father and not just some evil demon set out to deceive me, right? And send me down the wrong path. And that kind of question is a question of lack. That is a question of desire. Because what he's saying is, I do not experience myself as equal to the symbolic mandate given to me by the dead father. So the figure of authority par excellence is the figure of the dead father. That's Freud insists on that, Lacan insists on that. So I think it's not an accident that in Hamlet we have the figure of the dead father saying, take up your symbolic mandate. He's the figure of authority. He's the one commanding Hamlet, telling him what to do. And Hamlet doesn't reject it, but he also doesn't just do it. And I think that's a really, really important aspect of the play. And I think that's what connects it to this relationship that I'm going to emphasize between subjectivity and symbolic identity. So by not saying, yeah, okay, I'm just going to do it no matter what, Hamlet evinces the gap between subjectivity and symbolic identity. And as long as that gap exists, he can't just do the thing that his father commands him to do, right? So if there's a gap between subjectivity and symbolic identity, we're in a gray area. We're not able to just go follow the symbolic mandate and do what's expected of us. Like his father says, look, prove yourself to be a proper son. And son, again, is a symbolic category that Hamlet he's not sure if he is is a proper son because he's not sure if this symbolic authority is a proper authority. So the question of lack and in relationship to symbolic identity is always, I think, the basis for any political step that the subject can make. That if you're not, and I think Hamlet nicely shows this, that if you're not aware of or in touch with, and aware of can be unconsciously, you don't have to be consciously aware of, but in touch with your subjectivity and this failure to be your symbolic identity, then you're never going to be a politicized being. That not being, not coinciding with your symbolic identity, that is lacking, is the basis for how you can act against all the things that are given to you by the social symbolic structure.